While it seems as though every indie dev is on a mission to make a tribute to the 8-bit era, there haven't been many who have tried to make a game in the style of something a little more modern but still very ripe with nostalgia. The PlayStation, Saturn, and N64 days have reached the point now where they're just about as retro and fondly remembered as the NES, Master System, and the Pico. Remember that? Freedom Planet makes the distinction amongst tribute or nostalgia trip games of going beyond the trappings of the 8 and 16-bit eras. It's pretty ambitious given that it does have full voice acting and a fairly lengthy story mode for a platformer. Some people may be turned off by these additions for reasons which I'll explain later, but this game includes a classic mode which does away with the cutscenes entirely if you have no interest beyond the gameplay itself. One look at this game and one might think that it's a Sonic fan project, and that's partially accurate. Freedom Planet actually did begin as one, but the developer Galaxy Trail decided to scrap that idea and go for something completely different yet familiar, although not necessarily in the way you'd expect. Instead of playing explicitly like Sonic the Hedgehog, it functions a little more like a few classic Konami and Capcom games all rolled into one. Each character plays differently and has a wide array of abilities rather than being simple palette swaps of each other. You have the choice of playing as either Lilac or Carol for the story mode. Those two and the third heroine Mila are all available in classic mode too. Each character can move very quickly through the stages, and the lack of instantly taking damage based on mere contact with foes rather than from their attacks themselves means that you're not constantly punished for doing so. There aren't even very many pits to fall down and die instantly. This ties in with what I think Galaxy Trail had in mind when they gave the game its title. The biggest strength of Freedom Planet, in my opinion, is the freedom itself. While it is a fairly linear 2D platforming, combat-based, everything I touch myself to at night kind of game, it's the mobility you have that makes it such a joy to play through. You can explore the levels all you want or rush through them to try and beat your fastest time. Both playstyles are accommodated. While the physics in this game are questionable at best, with the characters being able to run upside down or ride a motorcycle up a sheer wall, it means that you're given the chance to explore the widely varied environments without your momentum constantly being ground to a halt. The way the crystals are often placed indicates that this, while maybe initially a flaw in the engine, was something that was noticed and designed around rather than just ignored. Just cover your ears and hope nobody will notice. Ship the game, they'll still buy it. What's also great about this game when compared to many of its predecessors is the lack of a time limit. While there is a timer present, it remembers that this isn't an arcade and doesn't kill you for taking too long. Counting up instead of down and more a means for timing yourself than a hard limit, you never feel pressured out of exploration. Instead of simply copying Sonic's ring system, you collect leaves that function as your health meter. Different enemy attacks will take off varying degrees of health, but typically the easier they are to avoid, the more you'll be punished for walking into them. The crystals function simultaneously as points and a means to gain extra lives, giving you the incentive to collect as many as you can. What's also nice is that if you're at full health and find additional leaves, they'll be converted directly to more crystals, so you're motivated even further to not take damage. After having just come off of a quote-unquote hard but fair game, I was pleasantly surprised to find that Freedom Planet's difficulty felt more like a gradual curve. On normal, it wasn't too easy, nor was it terribly difficult. Most importantly though, it didn't feel like you were just endlessly throwing lives away for tiny mistakes or intentionally cruel design. Death felt like it carried meaning, but not in a way that made you detest your very existence. Speaking of death, the story of this game runs the gambit of lighthearted and cutesy throughout several points in the game, to an unexpected decapitation in the opening cutscene. For the kids, it really does bring back memories of RPGs from the 32-bit generation in that regard. They pushed the envelope a lot further than what was acceptable in the Super NES and Genesis days, considering how even acknowledging an off-screen death was often frowned upon. Freedom Planet captures that same kind of feel as when the PlayStation was at its peak, with some games still using bright, cartoony sprites in favor of timeless 3D models, but not afraid to have some darker elements to them. Freedom Planet doesn't go too far, still more than acceptable for all ages, but it respects both a young and older audience enough to not pull its punches. While the story, character design, and voice acting may be an Achilles heel for this game to some, it really just grabbed me by the shoulders and asked, do you remember when games were fun? Do you remember when characters had simple charm and weren't afraid of being non-human? Do you remember not being kept up at all hours of the night from a crippling fear of the inevitable finality of death? Wait, I didn't write that. I'm gonna be honest, the voice acting isn't what most people would call masterful, and some have even called it flat out terrible. I'm going to disagree with that extreme, but it has its faults, and some people may not be able to enjoy it. Some characters sound a bit flat or overly cartoony, and it is oftentimes kinda corny. But to anyone who's calling it the worst, I sincerely doubt you're around for the days of House of the Dead 2, Resident Evil 1, Zombie Revenge. The writing itself does have a teenage anime fans making a game and RPG maker flair to it at times, but you have to keep in mind that the youth of these characters and the fact that this is an all-ages kind of game doesn't make that an entirely bad thing. It's also nice to see some unfiltered enthusiasm as far as ideas go, rather than tempering yourself to the point where it's all forgettable. Sure, some of the humor didn't always work for me, like a few of Mayor Zhao's running +5 gags, or Gong and Nira's take on the Zelda animated series, but the game still got some chuckles from me every now and then. The three heroines themselves have a very upbeat, positive energy about them. Lilac's selfless heroism and sense of adventure, Carol's playful density and scrappiness without being a horrible disappointment, and Mila's timid, naive, and somewhat mysterious nature just really work for this kind of setting. Plus, they're all total waifu material, am I right? Wait a sec, how old are they supposed to be again? Oh, God, I should probably cut that out. That's not good. That's not good. All three of these protagonists are endearing and not afraid to look like they're having a good time, even though the world around them is being invaded and on the brink of war. Some may call that inconsistent, but even at its worst in real life, there's still humor to be found. Life goes on, as they say. From how expressive their sprites are and from several subtle moments in the cutscenes, you really get a feel for these characters despite not being presented with too much information or extensive exposition. The scene where they're treated to the feast at Mayor Zhao's comes to mind. While they're giving some backstory on the dragons of the before time, Lilac and Mila stop eating to pay attention, but Carol just keeps at it. After a short while, you see Mila either get bored or just not comprehend what's being talked about, and she continues to eat alongside Carol. None of this is audibly brought to the player's attention, but if you look, it's there. It's little moments like this that can help elevate your characters, and I can't express enough how much I love that they went this extra mile. It's also nice to see a game with female protagonists that focuses more on heroics, friendship, and camaraderie more so than romance, sexuality, impressing a boy, babies, or being the subject of a director's creepy scrapbook. Not saying those themes necessarily make a game bad, but it's a much needed change of pace, honestly. This part with Carol struck me as something I haven't really seen often in a video game character. Some people have thought of this scene where she decides to part ways with Lilac and Mila as selfish because she's had enough of risking her own life. That's actually a pretty realistic feeling though, and her conflict of self-preservation and wanting to be with her best friend adds another little layer to her character. My mind's eye saw how this scene could have played out worse, with Lilac or Carol having a moral dilemma of not wanting to fight anymore because it never solves anything. Even Mila never said anything like that, and she's arguably the closest thing to a pacifist the group has. I'm glad that they didn't go this route, as it's a trope that's been played out, would serve to tarnish the strength of these characters, and makes very little sense to put in a game with a healthy focus on combat, which clearly solves the problems in this game's universe. Scenes like the sleepover where they're all watching the movie weren't entirely necessary to the plot, but it felt kinda natural to me. Just like with the dinner scene, having a few moments to see how these characters behave when they're not in a 2D platforming game just adds a little extra depth and relevance for the story mode being there in the first place. And if you don't like it, classic mode is right there. In case you couldn't already tell, I should point out that the game's music is fantastic too. The tracks range from iconic, catchy songs like the game's main theme, to the more atmospheric, relaxing pieces like Pangu Lagoon. Sound effects are satisfying and add positive reinforcement upon collecting a ton of crystals or killing a boss. It's all great stuff. That said, it's now time to bring up some of the game's more objective flaws. And I should mention that even while I did end up having a horrible time with AVGN Adventures, I was still thinking to myself, how could this game be improved, when I laid out a great deal of my gripes with it, rather than just attacking the creators or fans of the game. I know the kids today like extreme opinions, but my emotions have been dulled from years on the internet, in case you couldn't already tell from the way I talk. The game's options menu is a little lacking, with no real resolutions to speak of, save for a multiplication of the game's base windowed resolution itself. There's no option for sound effect or speech volume either. Also, I'd say a gamepad is all but necessary for the experience, as the keyboard, while rebindable, just doesn't feel right to me. I found a few bugs along the way, nothing game-breaking but still noticeable. Torque's mouth just ceased to move during this cutscene, for example. But this didn't happen the first time I played through, so I don't know why that happened this time. The game suffers from a few minor frame rate problems along the way too. My PC isn't the best in the world, but if I can get a benchmark like this in Street Fighter IV, Freedom Planet shouldn't be doing that. It doesn't happen too often, maybe dipping to the low 50s for a few moments before going back to 60 FPS like usual. I'm assuming this is a flaw in the engine, as the system requirements for this game are pretty modest. A few somewhat important elements of the story aren't really shown, and you're left wondering how the characters got out of some pretty dire situations. Their escape from prison comes to mind. This doesn't bother me too much, but given how much I actually enjoyed the story, seeing pieces missing was a little bit disappointing. Finally, there are some Kickstarter stretch goals that haven't been put into the game yet, at the time of this recording at least. These include Mila's story mode and Torque and Spade playable for Classic and Time Attack. These have been said to be in the works as free DLC, however. I do hope that these additions make their way into the game in the future, as I really do like Torque as a character a lot too. I'd actually even really like to see a story mode with him. I guess I'll be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of Spade, but being able to play as him may change my mind a bit. Now because I'm me, I'd be lying if I said that I didn't think to myself, and adult fanfiction begins now, at several points during the playthrough. Given the game's choice of both making use of anthropomorphic animals and heavy Asian influences, this was kinda bound to happen. Just how many fanfics were penned from this game's existence? After careful research, I've narrowed it down to a pretty undisputable number. Let's take a look.
She's like my tail, always right behind me.
I guess we'll have to do this the hard way. Nothing gets past my nose.
Can I touch your hair? Well, this stinks. How are we gonna get more money?
Oh, we should have plenty of things to do, especially with a new girl around.
It's not what it looks like!
Where do your duties lie, Prince?
He's dangerous with a capital D.
What if we bribe the guards?
And leave the brains intact if possible. I might use them for something.
I'll pretend I have to pee really bad.
I'd be lying if I said I was comfortable with this, but I honestly could use your help.
This is so much bigger than us. We're just kids.
That doesn't mean anything.
With all highbrow jokes aside, there's one more issue I sort of have with the game, which I discovered right near the end of my first playthrough. It turned out to be a half problem of sorts. The final stage is an endurance round with a seemingly never-ending onslaught of enemies, hazards, and bosses coming your way. While I'd praise that gradual curve in difficulty over time, this final section goes a bit off the rails in terms of difficulty spikes compared to the rest of the game. That said, it is the final stage, so it fills you with equal parts of dread and adrenaline, and Brevin is suitably menacing throughout.
You're forgetting something important about our troops. Oxygen.
When I got down to my last few lives, I admit that I got preemptively frustrated and distraught, mostly when wondering, where the hell are they gonna put me when I game over? After coming off of my previous episode, I was pessimistic enough that I'd expected to be put back at part 1 of the final stage, part 1 of 4, keep in mind. That said, when I inevitably lost all my lives to Brevin, I was both relieved and surprised upon continuing to find the game was kind enough to start right at him, in his final form no less. Death was still meaningful in that you're reminded of how often you dropped the ball, more so than artificially extending the length of the game at the risk of souring the experience outright. This is arguably a flaw in and of itself though, as using a continue should be used as another demerit of sorts during the post-game tally of time taken and deaths, as it somewhat negates the purpose of having a limited amount of lives to begin with. Still, if it means I'm not forced to go all the way back to the beginning of the final stage, then so be it. There are a few other nice little touches that this game does that I have to give honorable mention to. For one, the game's Steam achievements won't show up during gameplay, and are reserved for after a stage is complete, or when you exit to the menu. This is great because it doesn't get in the way of the game when you're in the thick of things. Another small thing that most games tend to overlook is interrupted dialogue during speech. At several points in this game's story, an interruption is just that, an interruption. You don't have a character awkwardly stop talking mid-sentence, waiting for you to advance to whatever cuts them off. It flows much more organically this way.
We mean no disrespect. We're just trying to... that the General said?
Oh, and there's a demo you can download and try before putting money down for this game. I guess Galaxy Trail wasn't embarrassed by their own product, and didn't attempt to hide it from both the general public and the press, like some multi-million-dollar publisher that I won't name called Ubisoft. I'll be honest, I went into this game expecting it to be good, but not great. At first glance, you may think it's just another one of the dime a dozen remember the 90s kind of games without a real identity of its own. While it certainly brings back all kinds of nostalgia from a place that not as many developers seem to tap into, Freedom Planet really exceeded my expectations, thanks to the sheer amount of passion put into the project, and that lack of filter or self-consciousness that makes some games so dull. So to recap, the mechanics are solid and well thought out, the levels and bosses are impressive, varied, and get progressively harder as the game goes on. The sound effects and music are great, and it has a pleasing visual style that says, there is a middle ground between 8-bit and AAA. What really took me by surprise though is how much I enjoyed the characters, setting, and story, all of which I was expecting to kind of just dismiss in favor of getting back to the game. There were those little in-the-background moments I mentioned earlier, some kind of dark themes, a threatening villain that shows what he's capable of, a vibrant world to explore, an upbeat, charming, and cute cast of characters. And yes, I said cute in a positive connotation. I love fantasy gore, death, Chinese noodles, and horrific imagery as much as the next guy or gal, but sometimes you just need something more cheerful and bright to keep yourself balanced. The game was possible thanks to a modest Kickstarter campaign of $25,000. Their original goal was only $2,000, keep in mind. Now, it may be old hat to shit all over Sonic Boom at this point, but let's do a little comparison, shall we? Both games came out in 2014, and everybody seems to love lumping Freedom Planet in with the Sonic franchise, so it's only fair, right? What was the budget of Sonic Boom? How's it feel to be the Jack and Jill of the games industry? There's so many games available nowadays that it can be overwhelming, and while indies are a nice alternative to the unsustainable, massive budget annual AAA franchise machine, I'm not going to pretend that they're all automatically good. Nor do I agree with the notion that AAA equates to bad either. There have been some amazing AAA games, and to ignore that would be kind of foolish, really. A great deal of indie games, though, simply just don't exude the sheer amount of heart that Freedom Planet does. Many indies carry an old Newgrounds kind of mentality of lol, violence, randomness, and poop jokes. And even if they are fantastic games too, I find it a little difficult to get too invested in their characters or worlds. They also risk dating themselves considerably with pop culture references and memes that are probably already played out by the time the game is released. This doesn't just apply to indies, of course. There's nothing wrong with that style. I mean, I love games like Isaac and Castle Crashers, and my sense of humor can dip into dangerously lowbrow places, but it's just a refreshing change to see an indie platformer have some sincerity to it, rather than attempting non-stop comedy with disastrous results. I'll acknowledge fully that some people won't be able to enjoy Freedom Planet as much as I did, for a number of reasons. You may not be able to enjoy cartoons, that's fine. You may not like the fact that the characters are animals, That's also fine, I get that. You googled gummy bears and the first thing you saw is something you wish you could forget. I get that, it happens. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Sometimes you even like it. Others can't look past the comparisons to Sonic, and I find that both understandable and a little maddening at the same time. Whereas Shovel Knight, another game that I love from 2014, is praised for having its roots in classic games like Capcom's DuckTales and Mega Man, this game has been dismissed by some as just another Sonic clone, as if that's even a thing anymore. It's a little like an unfortunate, all but dead franchise that I have a strong attachment to, so forgive me if I'm a little more motivated to speak in Freedom Planet's favor here. Freedom Planet, ironically having its roots as a Sonic fan game, managed to be something more timeless and original than a great deal of its peers, and even its predecessors. I recommend this game without any hesitation, but if you're not a fan of cuteness, anthropomorphic animals, cartoony dialogue, weird, sexy torture scenes, and 16 to 32-bit style sprite work, you need to get your head checked. You may not enjoy the game as much, but you're entitled to your opinion, certainly. The game really grabbed me from start to finish, partially bringing me back to my nostalgic youth, but also, more importantly, reminding me that games can still invoke these feelings in a time when it matters most of all, the present. It may be too late for some franchises, like Duke Nukem, Conker, or Castlevania, but the fact is that there are some amazing independent games being made right now, like Shovel Knight, Guacamelee, and obviously Freedom Planet. If these are the kind of games you want to see more of, supporting these smaller studios will do much more than continuously throwing money at every Lords of Shadow in the vain hope that we'll ever be treated to another Symphony of the Night again. Rather than feeling relieved to be done with this game, I felt happy in a different way when I saw those credits roll and that catchy theme song start up. Maybe some of the game's cheerful energy passed on to me, and my name is now slightly less a thing of irony. With the games industry becoming increasingly synonymous with disappointment, playing this game gave me a more optimistic outlook as to where games can go from here on out. I can only hope that the following scene was foreshadowing for things to come.
Just imagine it, Carol. There are other worlds out there, just like ours.
We should go on a space adventure someday. Don't you think that'd be so cool?
Are you kidding? It'd be the coolest thing ever!